leaving graffiti on the walls of the New World Order, crushed beer cans on their lawn, and putting drinks down without using a coaster. This is the Daniel Natal Show. The New American Magazine has an interesting article this month on transhumanism and the so-called Great Reset. To understand where certain forces want to take us requires understanding how society is shaped by different technological innovations. In the 1500s, for instance, the invention of the printing press by Johannes Gutenberg set off an intellectual revolution when mass literacy took place. Up until then, books written by hand were far too expensive to acquire, and people couldn't read them anyway since illiteracy was the rule. After books came down in cost and people started to learn to read them, new ideas could spread. As a result, people started to question things. They began reading their own copies of the Bible. In consequence, they began to question the Catholic Church, which culminated in the Protestant Reformation and war across Europe. The Church would lose half the continent and hemorrhage much of its power. The society was transformed by this leap forward. A similar technological revolution would happen a few centuries hence with the creation of the steam engine by James Watt in Scotland. His creation led to the Industrial Revolution and the rise of machines and factories. This also had political ramifications, as guns could now be produced so cheaply that normal people could afford them. Historian Carroll Quigley, in his book The Tragedy and the Hope, said that it was no coincidence that America acquired its freedom the same year that guns became mass-produced in factories. Though he was a man of the left, he admitted that because the government feared an armed populace, it was more responsive to it, hence granting people more political rights. Where the Industrial Revolution didn't happen, in feudal states like Russia or China, the people couldn't afford guns, and authoritarianism was the norm. As a result of the Industrial Revolution, monarchies fell all across the West, with kings replaced by presidents and prime ministers. Now we're facing political changes as a result of new technological revolutions. In the 1970s, the development of computers and relational databases allowed for expanded new tracking capabilities. This breathed new life into the technocracy movement from the 1920s, started by a man named Howard Scott. Scott was an engineer. He believed that society could be run like an engineering enterprise, but to control it, you'd have to track it. And in the 1920s, this simply wasn't technically possible. So the technocracy movement was eclipsed by communism and fascism. Scott believed that neither communism nor fascism was radical enough to institute the changes he envisioned, although he did express admiration for the Soviet Union putting chemicals in the water to render women infertile, and wondered why similar programs hadn't yet been enacted in the United States, as you can see here.
The hell with all this voluntary parenthood. That is not going to stop reproduction. And we have stated this in the public platform time and time again, that the female of the human species has had the power and the facility to dissolve the fetus without any deleterious results to her reproductive or her general metabolism. That's been known for generations. We didn't know what triggered it, but several biochemists have found out. It's tasteless, colorless, odorless. It's cheap to manufacture and put in the drinking water of a metropolitan water system. Now, if you haven't got a metropolitan water supply, you can put it in candy, or soft drinks.
The technocracy movement went into decline, but was resuscitated in the 1970s when Zbigniew Brzezinski was a professor at Columbia University and discovered all the writings of the technocracy advocates who were centered there back in the 1920s and 30s. Brzezinski was excited because now, with computers, the dream of the technocrats could be realized. He wrote about this in his book Between Two Ages in 1977. Brzezinski would later become a power player in Washington, where he founded the Trilateral Commission to advance these ideas, as well as being the force behind both Jimmy Carter and Barack Obama's rise to power. The technocrats wanted to create a new world run along scientific lines, where social engineering would be carried out and civilization directed from a technocratic elite. Now, as we enter the second decade of the 21st century, they have new tools to aid them. One of these being AI, artificial intelligence. The technocrats know that they don't have manpower enough to track all human movements and transactions, but machines can. So great resources have been marshaled to roll out new systems and algorithms that will see computers use artificial intelligence to run the society. According to cybernetics expert Mick Ashby in his paper Ethical Regulators and Superethical Systems, this could lead to what he calls a cyber-misanthropic dystopia, because the AI has not been programmed with an ethical system that would provide what he describes as a conscience. Without this moral layer built into the system, he sees us as lurching into a totalitarian state. The machine, after all, would not behave ethically, but with cold rationality. Bioethicist Dr. Amy Gutman says of her field, bioethics consists of informed reasoning, not heartless rationality. The AI, of course, would be the very essence of heartless rationality. It would by definition be unethical, amoral. The technocrats, as materialists, are not overly concerned about ethics. Rather, they see governance more in the Roman Empire model of bread and circuses, ruling by distracting the populace with entertainment and giving them socialist benefits like free food, free housing, free healthcare. Their chief tool would be universal basic income. This model of governance was explored by social scientist John B. Calhoun in his famous rat utopia experiments in the 1960s. He wondered what would happen if a socialist paradise was set up where rats no longer had to vie for food or shelter, and they were protected from every disease. In a reverse of Darwinism, circumstances didn't select for strength, intelligence, or speed. Instead, the rats became slow, fat, and violent. Some rats would engage in motiveless attacks on others. Others would hide in their apartments and groom themselves before mirrors. Calhoun called these the beautiful ones. Social organization broke down and the rats ceased breeding as they became sexually dysfunctional. Homosexuality became common, fertility rates dropped off, and ultimately, the rat utopia collapsed into death and destruction. The experiment has now been replicated thousands of times and all with the same result. What is chilling about the technocrats' vision of our new society is that it bears a shocking resemblance to the rat utopia. In this new society, strength, intelligence, and fitness won't be selected for, but weakness, stupidity, and obedience will. This will, of course, be assisted by the AI, which will be called in to manage the humans. Interestingly, when engineers allowed AI to design its own parts and inventions, it shocked everyone by going to the most efficient designs, which appeared to mimic nature. The hinge for a machine, for instance, would look like the elbow of an insect. A heat dispersal system in an automobile would look like the honeycombs of a beehive. See here.
But it comes back to us with designs that we, by ourselves, never could have imagined. And the computer is coming up with this stuff all by itself. No one ever drew anything, and it started completely from scratch. And by the way, it's no accident that the drone body looks just like the pelvis of a flying squirrel.
As AI imitates nature, is it conceivable that it will replicate natural selection in a parallel fashion, finding its own methods to weed out the weak, ignorant, and dysfunctional? Will it perceive of maximizing society's efficiencies with recourse to massive population reduction by means of a rat utopia? The exponents of the Great Reset tell us that it'll be wonderful that soon everything will be licensed and you will own nothing. They call this the circular economy.
Living systems have been around for a few billion years and will be around for many more. In the living world, there's no landfill. Instead, materials flow. One species' waste is another's food, energy is provided by the sun, things grow, then die, and nutrients return to the soil safely. And it works. Yet as humans, we've adopted a linear approach. We take, we make, and we dispose. The living world's cyclical model works. Can we change our way of thinking so that we too operate a circular economy? Let's start with the biological cycle. One solution may be to rethink the way we view ownership. What if we never actually owned our technologies? We simply licensed them from the manufacturers.
Klaus Schwab at the World Economic Forum announced recently that he was pleased as punch that within 10 years, no one would own anything. They would license it. But here's the thing about the licensing model of the circular economy. You thought you bought the book, but you merely licensed it. As a result, it can be withdrawn from your e-reader without your consent, or its pages altered. Barnes & Noble got in trouble for doing this. They set up an algorithm to change their competitor Amazon's Kindle's name to their own Nook e-reader. But this was exposed when people tried to read a novel, and where it should have said a Kindle of kittens, it had the nonsensical a Nook of kittens. The company had arbitrarily altered the book you were reading. How many times has this happened in other more serious cases, with you not even knowing about it? I asked a friend of mine who is a professor of sustainability and a great fan of the new circular economy if the wealthy will relinquish their property rights too, or is it just the peasants? I pointed out to him that 9/10 of human rights are based on property rights. Your own body is your own property. If you're told that you have no rights over this, can they medically experiment on you? What will the judicial system be like in a society that has no more property rights? We will all be cyber serfs. To my dismay, he said that he'd never considered these possibilities. nor had anyone in his community, nor to his knowledge had any of his colleagues ever had a symposium on it. And this is the danger of the so-called Great Reset. John Stuart Mill said that republics were stable because they rested on the people, like a pyramid resting on its base. Oligarchies, by contrast, operate for the benefit of a tiny elite. Hence they are like an inverted pyramid balanced precariously on its tip. And this is why oligarchies are inherently unstable and collapse. Could reading the New American Magazine boost your heart health, support your immune system, and help you lose 20 pounds of unsightly fat? The answer is no. But you should read it anyway. It'll keep you informed and provide information that cuts through the noise of lesser news outlets. thenewamerican.com. And don't forget to subscribe to us on social media and hit that like button.